Hello there, good morning. Thank you ever so much for tuning in. I'm Toby Mildon and welcome to Ask the Expert, which is an award-winning daily live show from 8:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. to help small businesses. If you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments of the live feed. And if you need any more advice, then please join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB community on Facebook. Accountants and business experts are on hand 24/7. And during the live session, we will be running a poll, so please do engage with this. And at the end, I will be revealing the results to you. So I am a diversity and inclusion consultant. I work with technology-based businesses to create a diverse workplace, but also create a culture where everybody feels welcome and empowered to do their best work. I've published a book, Inclusive Growth, which is a very practical guide for anybody who is head of HR in an organization to implement diversity and inclusion in a sustainable way. I worked with a whole range of clients, but before setting up my own consultancy practice, I worked in-house as a diversity and inclusion manager for both the BBC and Deloitte. And I've got a background in working in technology, and that's why I focus on technology clients. So over the last year, certainly over the last year, there's been a lot of headlines around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So last year, we saw the murder of George Floyd and the kind of the Black Lives Matter movement. We recently saw the murder of Sarah Everard, which brought into question women's safety. We've also seen the headlines about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on certain members of our community. So, for example, working women and working parents and people from an ethnic minority background. And then in the last couple of weeks, there was the recent report, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report. So there's certainly been a lot of headlines out there, really raising the importance and the profile for equality, diversity and inclusion in society. And this has caused many business owners to think about what their role is in addressing some of our inequalities that we see in society. So as a business leader, you might be thinking about the role that your business plays in society and how you can make a positive impact on your local community or society within the UK. You might also be thinking about your own employee experiences, how they feel when they show up to work each day. If you've got employees who are from, say, a minority group, do they feel, or do they show up in a work environment where they feel really valued and they can be their whole selves and they can do their best work? So if these are the questions that you've got as a business leader, one of the common questions that I get asked is, as a small to medium-sized business, what can I do about diversity and inclusion? Quite often we see, the large organizations talking about diversity and inclusion. You might log on to, the website of, say, one of the big four accountancy firms or one of the Magic Circle law firms or huge retail giants. And they clearly and boldly will be talking about diversity and inclusion for their organization. But I often get asked that as a small to medium-sized business, you might not have the resources that these big organizations have. And so what can you do with limited resources where your team is stretched, where you might not have, like a full-time HR specialist in your organization, for instance? But the good news is that, there are many, many things that small and medium-sized businesses can do. And I think it is particularly important because small and medium-sized businesses, really are the backbone of the UK economy. Collectively, small and medium-sized businesses account for the majority of the business economy within the UK. So I think there's a couple of things that you can do. So first of all is thinking about your culture as an asset. If you are a growing business and you're thinking about scaling up what you do, you need to really think about treating your culture as an asset, because as you take on more people and you start to embed behaviors, and culture is basically a sum of those day-to-day behaviors that we see in any organization, it will start to create a culture for an organization. And what kind of culture do you want for the future of your business? You probably want a positive culture where people can perform at their best, and where employees are as engaged in the organization as possible. But it's really thinking about culture as an asset to the organization and being very intentional about thinking about what you want your culture to think and feel like into the future, and what are some of the behaviors that you need to start embedding to start shaping that culture. The second thing to think about is how can diversity and inclusion help your organization grow? A lot of organizations treat diversity and inclusion as a box ticking exercise, or just a way to raise your marketing profile, or just this activity that's done on the side of somebody's desk. But actually, when diversity and inclusion is done really well, it's there to enable your business to grow. We know from lots of research that with diversity, we make better decisions, we're better at creating and innovating, we get away from groupthink. For instance, you can engage with a diverse customer base or diverse client base. And so when your organization mirrors or reflects the community or the society or the clients that you work with, then you are in a better position to be able to grow and develop your business. The third point is to really think about the psychological safety as well as the physical safety. And this is something that has come up a lot in the last 12 months, definitely, and looking at people's mental health and well-being whilst in lockdown. And psychological safety is something that we talk about a lot. Psychological safety is somebody's ability or confidence to be able to speak up when they see something that's wrong or not going to plan. And it's about creating an environment where you have that psychological safety. And then the fourth point really is about maintaining a positive reputation for your organization. Unfortunately, we've seen the headlines when organizations have got diversity or equality wrong in their organization. But when you do diversity and inclusion well, then you create this positive reputation. You become a magnet for talent. People want to come and work for you. They talk positively about working for you as a great place to work. And therefore, it becomes easier for you to attract the talent that you need going forwards as you grow your business. So as a small business with limited resources, what can you do? So there's three things. So first of all, listen to your people. Try and understand their day-to-day experiences within the workplace. I often talk to my clients about identifying the speed humps and the roadblocks that slow people down or prevent people from thriving in their work. So identify those blockages, and as a business leader, start to disassemble and remove those speed humps and roadblocks that slow people down or prevent people. So for example, if you are doing recruitment, you might look at your recruitment process and ask yourself, who might struggle to get through our recruitment process? If, for example, you ask people to upload a CV to your website, if your website doesn't work with a screen reader, which is technology that blind people use to be able to navigate the IT, then that means that they won't be able to upload their CV to your website, for instance. if you insist on doing interviews face-to-face really early in the morning, that might be difficult for working parents, for example, who have to do the school run or homeschooling. So there are all sorts of things that can kind of get in people's way. And then the third point is to come up with an action plan, because that's when, if you've got a plan, then you can start to make the change that happens. In your organization, you will already have lots of plans. You might have a marketing plan, you might have a business growth plan, you might have a data security plan, you might have a health and safety plan, you might have a recruitment plan. You will have lots of plans. And adding a diversity and inclusion plan and making sure that it's really aligned with all of the other business activities that you're doing, so that it's really integrated into what you're doing day to day, is the best way to go. So we're now going to start taking questions. So please do drop your questions in the text box in the live feed that you're watching, and I can answer. We've got some coming through. So I've got a question from, first of all, from Pasco, who's on Instagram. Pasco says, "Hi, Toby. Can you give an example of how to break diversity into a job, or bake diversity into a job description?" Yeah, so that's really good, Pasco. There's lots of things that you can do on a job description to make sure that diversity and inclusion is embedded. So first of all, it's worth looking at the kind of language that you're using on your job ad or your job description. So we tend to have in language masculine and feminine terms, for example. And if you have a job ad which is full of masculine terms, then that can prevent people who are kind of leaning towards the feminine terms to kind of be turned off by that job advert. So there are various tools that you can do to put your job ad through. So there's artificial intelligence. So there's a system called Textio. So Textio, for example. And you just copy and paste your job ad, and it will start to point out the language that you're using and how to make that language more inclusive. There can be, not only is it the kind of the language that you're using, but it's whether you include key terms, things like, "We are welcome to talking to you about flexible working," for example, or we if you are a member of, say, the Disability Confidence Scheme, which is a scheme that the government runs, so the Department for Work and Pensions, and you can talk about being a disability confident employer, for example, and you can put that on your job ad. So there's things like that that you could do that just make it more appealing for people to think about working for you. But there's kind of all of the assets around your job description as well, Pasco. So it's things like, if you've got a careers page on your website, how reflective or how diverse is your careers page? So, if I was to log onto your careers website, could I see myself reflected in the images that you're using, for example? And therefore, I can see myself, even if this happens on a unconscious level, because a lot of our decisions are made through our unconsciousness. So even if on an unconscious level, I look at your website and I go, "Oh yeah, I can actually see myself working for this organization." Again, that gives me confidence to apply. So thank you for your question. It's a really good question. Cool. So got a question here from Kareem on Facebook Messenger. So Kareem says, "As a CEO, I'm taking pride in the culture of my company, but there's always more that you can do. As a small company, how can we help create a fairer society? I think it's hard to know where to start." That's a really good point. I think it's really great that you are focusing on culture, and there's always more to do. It's constantly work in progress, because culture is fluid. It's constantly evolving and changing and adapting with the times. as a small business, creating a fairer society, I think that's a really great goal to have in terms of what's your impact on having a fairer society. It is difficult to know where to start because there's so much that you can do. I think, it's important to just start with one thing. I know it sounds a bit kind of cheesy or a bit tongue in cheek, but I think if you can just start with doing one thing really well, then you can then sort of evolve and build on that. So you might want to start local. So I don't know what your business is, but for example, you could work with a local school or college to help young people into your industry. So, for example, I've worked in technology businesses where there's, often a gender balance challenge. Working in tech is a very male-dominated sector. So I've worked in organisations where we've done a lot with local schools to work with young girls and women around educating them around technology and technology jobs, so that when they come to choosing GCSE subjects or when they come to choosing A-level subjects or thinking about careers when they go off to university, that they've got a whole set of skills around working in technology, for instance. So there could be a local organisation. There's often, there are sort of local, so working with a local school or local college. I've worked with, a client who's developed a really good relationship with like a local mosque, for example, or working with a charity, for example, getting people ex-military personnel who've been injured whilst, in service, helping them sort of move from working in a career in the forces to working in a career in business. So starting local and doing that, and making an impact on one individual's life can be such a profound thing on that person's life. So I've got there's a question from Socrates on Twitter. So good morning to you too. Thank you for joining me. Socrates says, what's your advice on handling a situation when a colleague is not accepting of another diversity? Cool. So I think the question that we need to ask ourselves here is about what is their behavior, and how, as a business leader, are you, how comfortable are you with accepting that kind of behavior? And is that the kind of behavior that you want going on in your organization? So without knowing too much about the situation, it's difficult for me to kind of give advice. If you've got, say, two employees where you've got one employee who, I'll just have to kind of make up a kind of fictitious scenario, for example. But, let's say you've got somebody who is working in your organization who's, say, transgender, for example, and you've got another employee who's always misgendering that employee. I mean, that's an example of what we call a microaggression. So microaggression are those kind of small slights of behavior that are designed to undermine or demean somebody else. So it could be, for example, always mixing you up with somebody else in the office because you come from a similar ethnic background, for example. It could be talking over people in the meeting, or taking or somebody else taking credit for your ideas, or quite often I've worked with women in the past where they feel like the admin tasks fall to them, for instance, in meetings. So these are kind of examples of microaggressions, and I think if this kind of thing is going on, then you need to kind of tackle that behavior head on. You need to kind of explain to people what you find to be accepting or not acceptable behavior. And you might have to get an intermediary to help facilitate like a HR person, or if you use like a third-party HR advisory service, quite often they provide like a mediation service that can help if you don't have like a HR person. And yeah, but it's about sort of really thinking about what kind of behavior you deem acceptable or not. But it's an interesting question, so feel free to follow up with me offline, and I'll see if I can help you out in any way. I think if you just Google me, Toby Mildon, or go on my website, mildon.co.uk, then you just drop me an email or find me on LinkedIn. Cool. So got another question here. Yeah, Claudette on Facebook says, as a business leader, how can I support staff that feel that they've been traumatized by events happening in the world? I try to listen and have said that my door is always open, but is there anything else I can do? Yeah, brilliant question, Claudette. I think there are definitely people in the world who have felt traumatized by what's going on in the world. Like, a lot has happened over the last 12 to 18 months. I mean, a lot has happened, and I do work with clients where it is kind of opening up wounds for people working, in the workplace, and as an employer, you often see that unfolding, and as an employer, it's like you need, obviously, you want to be able to support and respond to staff. So I think there's a few things to do. I think having an open door policy is really good, and being just being a very kind of empathetic, active listener, also almost even being like a coach type leader, coaching style leadership is really supportive, and working on your own education and awareness around things like racism and sexism, and ableism, and creating an inclusive work environment, and sort of doing your own work is really good. And I think as a business, it's about putting in some more of the formal structures. So I don't know how large your organization is, but for example, if you've got an employee assistance program, quite often, even as a small organization, you can sort of buy an employee assistance program on like a monthly subscription, and you can give employees access. And quite often that might involve counseling services or advisory services over the phone, for example. If there's a particular issue, for example, if you've noticed, again, I'm just kind of having to make assumptions, but if you've noticed something going on around race, for example, in the organization, you might want to reach out to an expert who's like on race, on racism, and ask them to come in and support you as a kind of like outside expert or a consultant to kind of give you support, because obviously you're not able to be an expert on all matters, but you can bring in people to support you. So there's things that you can do, and I think it's also about, I mentioned earlier about that psychological safety, creating that environment where people feel safe to be able to speak up and talk about issues in the workplace, and they won't feel at any detriment for doing so. And also, actually, the power of storytelling is really important, encouraging employees to share their lived experiences. So if you've got an employee, for example, who's willing and able to talk about, what it's like to be from an ethnic minority background, to share their lived experiences with their colleagues, that's hugely powerful, because quite often people in the workplace are just, they're a little bit, they just don't have that education or awareness. And actually, it's just raising the bar, raising that education and awareness can really help. So hopefully there's a few things there that can help you. So yeah, wonderful questions coming through. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that. So got a question here from Fausta. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name on Twitter. So great to see you back on Ask the Expert. Actually, I recognise your name from when I was on here last time, so thank you for tuning back in. Nice to see you as well. So yeah, the question was, you mentioned psychological safety. How can we go about informing that? I think the main part about psychological safety is creating that environment where people feel safe to be able to speak up. So as a business leader, it's about making it clear that, if there's any behavior going on in the organization that is preventing people from speaking up, then that won't be tolerated. Um, Now, there are things that you can do. So I don't know how big your organization is, but you can you can get anonymous feedback from staff to try and understand about the challenges that they have in being able to speak up. So there's various apps out there. There's a startup called In Chorus, IN and then Chorus, and they provide a way for employees to be able to, like, in less than 60 seconds, to be able to just record any kind of microaggressions that I mentioned earlier going on in the organization. And when you log onto the system as a kind of admin of the system, you can see what kind of behaviors are going on, where in the organization that's happening. That gives you a really good indicator of what's going on. Then you can tackle that behavior head on. And then we got a final question here from Conrad on Facebook. So Conrad says, do you have any examples of how I can educate employees on inclusion initiatives? And how do you get employees excited about them so that they engage? I own a restaurant, and the last year has really got me thinking that I want to go about doing things differently and support my staff in these kinds of questions. That's a really, really good question, Conrad. Thank you. I think, I think one thing that I would suggest that you do is actually start with your staff. Get them to, I suppose, say to them as a business leader, say to them what your intention is about diversity and inclusion, why it's important to you and your restaurant, and then get them to get involved. So they might have a particular interest area. So they might say, actually, we want to start by doing something like celebrating International Women's Day, for example, or International Day of Disabled People in December. So I would say start with your employees. So first of all, set your intention about why it's important to you personally and to your business, and how it's going to help your business thrive as we move out of bounce back from the pandemic. And then get them really involved, because that will get them engaged. So ask them what they want to do, and help them contribute to your agenda. So we're just going to wrap up now. We've got the poll results are coming in. So we asked you, have you ever sacrificed anything for your employees? And the answer is 40% said yes, and 60% said no. So that's a really interesting result. So thank you very much for contributing to that. So if you've got any questions, please do get in touch with QuickBooks support team on Facebook. And if you then want to contact with me, please send me a message on LinkedIn or go to my website, mildon.co.uk. Coming up on Ask the Expert tomorrow, we've got Arona, who is the managing director of Majors Accounts, which is a family-run firm. Tune in to learn how to grow using the cloud. And a reminder that if you need any more advice, please join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB community group on Facebook. You've got accountants and business experts on there on hand 24/7. Thank you ever so much for tuning in today. It's been really great answering your questions, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you very much.